Welcome to the Singapore Management University podcast series, where we feature the latest insights and perspectives from our faculty. His Excellency Herman Van Rompuy was in SMU on the 17th of November 2014 as the 17th Speaker of the Presidential Distinguished Lecturer Series, or PDLS. In a wide-ranging discussion moderated by SMU President Professor Arnoud de Meyer, His Excellency Van Rompuy shared his comments on topics such as the G20 Leaders Summit 2014, economic reforms in Europe, and the defining moments of his presidency in the European Council. His Excellency Van Rompuy was elected as the first full-time President of the European Council in November 2009. In 2012, he was re-elected for a second term. At the time of his first election, he was Prime Minister of Belgium. Prior to that, he had served in Belgium as Speaker of the House of Representatives and in several government positions, including as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Budget. An author of several books, he has also received numerous awards and distinctions in his career. In the first of a two-part podcast, we feature selected highlights of the PDLS in November.
So, Your Excellency, I would like to start off with a simple question. What were your impressions of the G20? What can we take away? What are the takeaways from the G20 as you saw it?
First of all, thank you having the occasion to have a talk with you, fellow Belgian/Flemish.
True. It's even more...
Detail is important. Your origins are even the very city of Oudenaarde, which is the hometown of my wife, so we are really very close. But I come back from the G20 meeting. It will be my last G20 meeting, and I didn't attend the first one in London and in Washington. That was just after the financial crisis, and actually the G20 at the level of leaders was established to give an answer to the financial crisis. And they were at that time, let's say, rather successful. Afterwards, my analysis is that those decisions, although important one and successful, were rather easy compared to what we have to do now. Why? Because saving a bank, at that time it was putting public money in it. And the stimulus program, deficit spending, are not the most difficult decisions. Afterwards came the regulation, financial regulation. Yeah, you touch upon vested interests. Then afterwards, how can we coordinate economic policies in such a diverse landscape as the global economy? The Eurozone has other problems as the United States. Emerging economies have other problems as the Eurozone, and in the emerging economies you have a lot of differences. So coordinating economic policies is quite a tough task. And we have the same problem, by the way, inside the Union. We have to coordinate among the 19 of the Eurozone and the 28 of the Union. Yesterday, and the day before yesterday, we took, I think for the first time in a couple of years, concrete decisions. Focusing, of course, on growth and jobs, that's nothing new, but focusing on investment. Investment, infrastructure investment, private investment. So this global investment initiative, and also creating a hub where the policies for the coming years are coordinated in some way, that was rather something concrete, not just expressing intentions, but focusing on concrete results. But again, it is a difficult task to bring all those economies on the same line. But the G20 meeting is not only important for the meeting itself and the conclusions of the meeting. The G20 meetings are also important because you have a lot of not side events but bilateral meetings where leaders can meet. And then I make in this context a more general observation. It is the sixth time I attend this kind of meeting. When you see all those leaders, the President of the United States, the President of China, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of the Russian Federation, all around the table discussing the economy and even topics beyond the economy. It's quite reassuring because they are in speaking terms. And I think it is the first time in human history that on a regular basis, leaders all over the globe meet each other, discuss, try to find common stance, and this is hopeful for the world as a whole. I'm not naive, and I'm not, whatsoever, after all those years in politics, you lost the last millimeter of naivety, but it's quite an experience each time to see 80% of the world economy represented. People who have the highest responsibilities, most of them are directly elected, and then all discussing and on the same topic and looking for solutions. As long as this exists, then I would say, even if the outcome is not always what we expected, but as long as this exists, I'm hopeful for the humankind, that we can keep the world at peace, and that we have now an institution that is even more important to some extent than the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. Although in some moments the UN is of utmost importance, but here on a regular basis that kind of meeting is quite exceptional. And so I was very honored to attend those meetings, and again this time we focused on investment, concrete result, growth and jobs. Without growth and jobs, most of our societies become unstable. And certainly in what we call industrial nations, their social systems come under huge tension, even threatening the existence of the survival of the systems. So our system, our socio-economic system is based on growth. Without growth, we go not only in social and economic problems, we go in major political problems. So this is of the utmost importance that we join efforts together.
Are you optimistic about the growth prospects? Because I'm not an economist, I admit it, but when I read sort of economic predictions for the coming years, it seems as if the world is going into a slower mode of growth. Almost no growth in Europe, limited growth in the United States. The emerging countries, China in particular, go to a lower level of growth than before. It's still 7%, still pretty good, but it's all a little bit lower. Are you optimistic?
Yeah, optimistic and pessimistic, that's no feelings that are really interesting, I find. But it can be very superficial, because it can change overnight. But I have a more nuanced view on this. Nuance in this sense that the growth in China is still 7%. Probably is more sustainable at 7% than at 10%. Growth in the United States is surprisingly high, partially the result of past policies. They put their financial house in order right after the financial crisis, was very helpful today. And of course there is the shale gas revolution, a major game changer. It is due to, let's say, to the accident of nature, but also mainly, I think, to the system who allows to develop that kind of energy resources. So they have now growth of around 3%, which is quite high, surely for a mature economy, because it's much more difficult to have high growth rates for mature economies than for emerging economies. Yeah. In the emerging economies, there is a differentiation. And there I join not your pessimism or your lack of optimism, but the diagnosis that it is lower growth than we expected. Russia is in recession. Brazil is almost in recession. Others have quite a lot of difficulties, not to speak about South Africa, for instance. In the Eurozone, we have a low economic growth. We have a structural economic growth of 0.5%. That's much too low let's say, the welfare systems we have to finance. Of course, we can do better, and we will do better. We will do better, but it takes some time. It takes some time. But you have to look at, let's say, you have to look at all those things in a longer term perspectives. And in this sense, I'm not so pessimistic, to use those words again, because major efforts are made to reorient the economies. It is the case in China. I think it will also be the case in India. I think in Brazil they will draw the conclusions of the recent presidential elections and let's say in the voice of the people, and that will be an incentive to do it in another way and to do it better. And in the Eurozone, we are embarked in a major countries on structural reforms. And some of our governments are taking courageous decisions, confronting also parts of public opinions, some parts of their own electorate, not to speak of Italy or France and so on. So everybody knows that reforms of all kinds are inevitable. In political life, as in personal life, you often act in front of the abyss, knife on the throat, and with your back against the wall. And then you take action. You can say it is too little and too late, but even in the private sector it is often the case. So I think that these are an awareness all over the place that we have to change, that we have to reform in difficult political circumstances, in lively democracies as the European ones. But I see that leaders take their responsibilities, and that's quite encouraging.
What do you think, focusing a little bit more on Europe, you say we need to have these structural reforms, or we are implementing these structural reforms without looking at immediate things that need to happen, because that probably is very difficult for you to talk about, given the fact that you're stepping down by the end of the month. But sort of medium term, what do we need to do in Europe to get that economy going again? What are the sort of structural reforms or the ideas that you have about where does Europe need to go? What needs to work in Europe to make it successful?
And only speaking on the economic side.
Yeah.
So a lot can be done, has been done in some member states at the national level. And there, the reforms of the labor market and reforms in our pension systems are of key importance. In the labor market, it is about reforming taxation on labor, because we are imposing too heavy burden on labor, making labor of employment in general less attractive. That is not only the relation between, let's say, you have two kinds of competitiveness. I will describe it in this way. You have the competitiveness of your own country, your own firm, vis-à-vis the rest of the world, but you have also a competitiveness between the factor labor and the factor capital. If you put too heavy taxes on labor, then the incentive to have substitution of labor by capital is you enhance that substitution. So we have the duality in the labor markets, duality between older workers with fixed contracts and younger workers with temporary contracts. So this becomes unsustainable because the first who are fired are the younger ones. So we have to have a system that is less discriminatory than we have now in most of our member states. And of course we have all kinds of what we call flexibility in the labor market, so that employment can be adapted also more quickly to changes in economic activities. That is not easy because there's a lot of resistance of the insiders, and they forget that there are outsiders. The outsiders are the 11% of the labor population who is unemployed. And then you have the reforms of the pension systems. In most all of the country, you have a prolongation of retirement age, de facto or the legal age. In our own country, I can still say our own country.
Yeah.
In our own country, it is now, it will become 67 years, but only in 15 years' time. So I am really somebody who is anticipating all this, because I will retire at 67. So this is the retirement age that will be the retirement age of the future in our countries. But we are now de facto sometimes at 59 and 60%. That is, of course, unsustainable, with the average life expectancy of above the 80. In the 50s, we had in Western Europe and in my country, in your country, we had a de facto, and legally, but it was the same at that time, retirement age of 65. The average life expectancy was 66. That's all. And now the gap is more than 20 years. But that is mainly the responsibility of the member states. From the Union on, we can push, we can urge, we can have some kind of peer pressure, but it's ultimately their responsibility. At the level of the Union, there we have to exploit much more than we have now our single market. We tend to say Europe, and it's true, we have the biggest single market in the world, 500 million people with the highest purchasing power in the world. But we have to deepen our single market, not only in the circulation or the free circulation of goods and services, but also, let's call it, although the word is not the right one, in industry. We need an energy union. We need a single digital market. We need a research area all over the European Union. In each of these domains, we are taking important steps, but we have to do much more than we are doing now. There's a huge potential for growth still in the European Union if we join forces, if we can abandon national champions, if we see what can be achieved in the space of the 28, who are too much focused still on a place, national states, and less on the space, the European Union. So I'm not desperate at all. There's still a huge potential for growth in the European Union.
Okay.